offer some lessons for Central Asian.
Common place for great power.
Political will is important.
US-China competition.
Which vulnerability narratives
stay away from conflicts.
Lead unintended consequences.
Increasing tourist numbers arriving in Central Asia.
Climate change.
Common and collective position and perspective.
You're with us or against us. Hello everyone, welcome to CPR Talks. Today we are joined by Dr. Chang Yun Yan, right?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. Dr. Chang is program head for military studies at the Rajaratnam School of International Studies in Singapore, which is one of the top academic institutions, and I would say also one of the top think tank. Dr. Chang is a former naval officer and scholar with a PhD from the University of Queensland and a leading expert on security issues in Asia Pacific. His work has appeared in top journals like European Journal of International Studies, the Chinese Journal of International Politics, and International Studies Quarterly. So, Dr. Chang, welcome again to our talk. So you were the head of both a naval officer and academic. So how has that shaped your perspective on security issues?
No, thank you very much for the question. And I want to begin by really thanking CPR for having me here. Thank you very much. And that's a very interesting question. I would say that having actually done security gives me a real-life, practical experience and perspective on some of these issues that we are talking about from time to time, whether we are talking about the hot topics of the day, right, like the South China Sea disputes or sometimes US-China competition. Having been involved in some of these actual practices, I think that, I don't want to blow my own horn, but I think that it gives me a good ground to stand on, right, to really look at some of these things, right, and clearly they are also close to my heart, right, okay, because this is what I've done in my previous career.
That's great, wonderful. Let's start with one of your core research topics, hedging. In your International Studies Quarterly article, you described hedging as a way for developing countries to preserve autonomy and avoid alignment, right? Managing risk and other, like using ambiguous signals, right? So looking at Central Asia today, how do you see their strategies are evolving, and could Singapore's hedging experience be applied or offer some lessons for Central Asian countries in this shifting international order?
Right. Thank you very much. Let me begin with a caveat, right? I am by no means an expert on Central Asia, so take what I say with a pinch of salt. But that aside, I think that today, right, what is important is that the international environment and system is in a state of flux, right? And what this really means is that all the different states and countries within the system are faced with this uncertainty, right? And with hedging as a way to mitigate such uncertainty, I do think that it has got certain advantages for different states, no matter whether they are in Southeast Asia or Central Asia, to utilize, right, to try to survive within the uncertain environment a bit better, if you would. Right. So yes, I think that even for Central Asia, right, there are things within hedging that can be useful to try to help mitigate uncertainty within the international environment today.
Okay, well, I have follow-up question when it comes to hedging. What do you think, how hedging is different from outright neutrality? In the context of, I don't know, maybe Southeast Asia or Central Asia.
Right. Thanks.
How would you describe it?
Thanks for the question. And that's actually a very important question, right? Now, when it comes to neutrality, then neutrality is a internationally recognized stance, right? With regard to various things about the neutral state in question, essentially not being involved in some of the struggles and other conflicts, right? Okay, that their neighboring states or elsewhere may be dealing with, right? But neutrality by itself is not a way to deal with uncertainty. It is simply a stance that the state takes, right, to basically stay away from conflicts, right? Conversely, hedging is a strategy to manage uncertainty, and it is therefore not a way to avoid conflict per se, but it is a way to actually deal with such conflict, right? Okay, especially within the uncertain environment that states face. So in that. When it comes to hedging, right, like you mentioned earlier, I think that when it comes to hedging, there are three important signals. The first is the state's own assessment of the situation, okay, whether the state thinks that it is dealing with uncertainty or threats or other conflicts, right? Okay, and when it is dealing with actual conflict and so on, then sometimes then hedging might not necessarily work here. Right. The second part of hedging has then got to do with the actual practices that the state adopts to basically try to mitigate such uncertainty. Right. Okay. And that in itself is also going to be very different from a neutral stance per se. Right. Because, and this is the next important part of hedging, right? Because when it comes to hedging, these practices, what they do is to signal ambiguity, right? Okay, to the different parties so that it is clear to the different parties that the hedger, right, is not taking their sides. Okay, but in this manner, it is a nuanced thing, right? Because sometimes what not taking sides mean is that the hedger can actually be on the side of one party for a certain issue, but on the side of another party for another different issue, right? So not taking sides doesn't mean that the hedger is always, always non-aligned and neutral in that regard. But really that what the hedger does is to always choose its own side, right? And therefore it will side with parties, okay, when it serves its own interest. Okay, and that would be very different from what a state under the policy of neutrality would do.
Thank you for your insight. So when we talk about these great powers, they usually have still like a Cold War mentality, right? Like they say like you're with us or against us. So within this context and within context what you said, are there any pitfalls for smaller states adopting this hedging strategy?
Right. Thanks for the question. So let me begin by saying that I don't think that the Cold War mentality functions here, in the sense that it is commonplace for great powers to expect smaller states to bend to their will, right? Okay, so it's not really a Cold War thing per se, right? But as opposed to an international relations thing, and that is ultimately because that's what they are, right? They are great powers, and they expect essentially other states to follow their lead on some of these things. Now, and therefore, having said that, naturally, hedging doesn't mean that it will always be effective, right? Okay, because clearly, the great powers will want smaller states to choose their side, right? Okay, and that is simply a function of foreign policy. Okay, and therefore, when it comes to this hedging, then smaller states will always be faced with a certain form of pressure, right? Okay, to do otherwise, right? And I think that is not basically inevitable, right? But nonetheless, this, however, doesn't mean that hedging will never be effective, because it can. But ultimately, it's a question of what the hedger does, okay, and how it does them. Right. Okay. So and that is actually that is also my next project and what I want to look at, right? To look at the interplay, right, between the hedger and the great powers.
Thank you for your insights. So, another fascinating area of your research is vulnerability, right? For example, you've written about securitization of vulnerabilities, a process where certain risks are elevated to justify exceptional measures. From your perspective, for example, in Central Asia, maybe like which vulnerability narrative stands out most right now? Maybe like migration or climate change, or I don't know, digital threat. We have now like one of the popular topics is food security, and which do you think will dominate in the coming decade, in your understanding?
Right. Thank you. So once again, I'm not an expert on Central Asia. Now, but having said that, I think that the current dangers and vulnerabilities and risks and so on, right, they clearly apply to Central Asia too, right? One important one is the issue of climate change, right? I was just reading the BBC this morning, right? And it was saying that even when it comes to things like peak travel period, climate change has actually changed such periods, right, over time because now when you consider the summer holidays, for instance, right, look at what's happening in Southern Europe, especially right now, right, heat waves, droughts, and so on, and that affects actually tourism. And even in Central Asia, that must be true, right? I look at the increasing tourist numbers arriving in Central Asia, Uzbekistan as part of the Silk Road, and all these things all these issues stemming from climate change, right, will affect tourist numbers when they get here, right, what they do, right? So climate change, you will imagine that climate change, right, has all these effects about essentially heating, right, getting hotter, okay, and that's true, but then it has got follow-up repercussions, right, like tourist numbers and so on, right? So I think climate change will be part of Central Asia's calculus, right, especially when Central Asia is developing so rapidly, right? It will affect industrialization, it will affect your economic policies, and so on and so forth, right? But nonetheless, climate change is also not the only problem, right? Increasingly, cyber threats are getting more and more pertinent, okay, as Central Asia becomes more and more network, right? Okay, so all these things will happen, right? Before I came to Uzbekistan and like you know, this is my first time in Uzbekistan. I was looking up travel blogs and everything, right? Yeah, and one of the thing I saw was that Uzbekistan had one of the slowest internet rates, internet connectivity and speed in the world. Okay, but when I get here, it isn't true, right? I mean, I don't notice any discernible lag in my internet speed and everything, right? And this just demonstrates how fast Central Asia is opening and developing, right? But along with such openness, right, then the vulnerabilities from the cyber realm and so on, right, will also proliferate.
Yeah, indeed. Actually, like digitalization is one of the big hot topics in Central Asian countries. For example, when it comes to this communication or relations, cooperation with our neighboring countries, for example, when it comes to China, to European unions, digitalization always like part of the picture. We talk a lot about this one. At the same time, climate change is big issues, I would say. Like even though like the world is getting warmer and warmer, but as the rate of warmness in Central Asia is higher than other places on the earth. So this is also
right.
like
I'm not sure it's higher than Singapore, but
to be honest, I don't know. I cannot answer to your question. I've never been to Singapore. Like when I visit, I will let you know.
Please come soon.
Yeah. So like. From your perspective, so within the context of securitization, could over-securitization lead unintended consequences? Maybe like in case of digital threats or maybe like climate change?
Right. Oh, no. Naturally, of course. Right. And if we look at securitization theory, under the traditional Copenhagen model, their preference was actually to desecuritize, okay, to make it no longer a security issue, as opposed to securitizing issues, right? Because they understood that, with security, okay, and turning things into security, then there are problems and repercussions and consequences. Okay, and some of these consequences may not be ideal, right? May not be preferred. So actually, they prefer to desecuritize and turn issues into areas of politics rather than exceptional security, really, right? And let me give you an example, right? When you look at, for instance, Israel, right? Some of the scholarly work done on Israel's securitizations of its many problems highlight the idea, right, okay, that Israel's society today exists in a state of over-securitization, such that all issues become matters of security when really they shouldn't be. Okay, and that is one pertinent danger, right, when it comes to such over-securitization.
Okay, interesting. So let's shift from risk to opportunities. For example, let's talk about ASEAN experience. So in Central Asia, we talk a lot about ASEAN, ASEAN countries, ASEAN model when it comes to regional cooperation. So some people here still believe ASEAN experience can be a good model for regional cooperation. So ASEAN brought together very different countries to address common challenges, which elements of the ASEAN approach do you think Central Asia could adopt in their regional, in their attempt to enhance regional cooperation?
Right. Now that's a very broad question, but perhaps let me start by talking a bit about the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, or ASEAN for short. Now, to begin with, right, ASEAN is very, very diverse. Right? Okay, today, the 10 member states of ASEAN, okay, vary greatly in terms of their societies, in terms of their economic progress and development, even political regimes, right? And the people, right, within this regional collective we think of as Southeast Asia, the people are a very, very mixed group, right? Okay, and without essentially a common experience, right, they have shared over time, really, right? And this, I say this because it highlights the challenges that ASEAN has, right, when it comes to doing things collectively. And over time, as the association expanded from the original 5 members of 1967 to 10, right, around the turn of the millennium, to probably membership for Timor-Leste soon, right? Then we are looking at a very diverse bunch of states, right? And this is further complicated by the ASEAN way of doing things, which is about getting consensus, which is about that informality of building such consensus, okay, which is really about also, importantly, non-interference in the domestic affairs of each other member state. So all these things present challenges for the association, right, to collaborate on issues in which there is no basically common and collective position and perspective. Right? One good example has got to do with the South China Sea disputes. Okay, but overall, it's not just the South China Sea disputes. It is when there is no common position that consensus is very difficult to build, right? And therefore, the ASEAN processes typically take time. The ASEAN processes can sometimes be slow. Okay? And last but not least, the ASEAN processes, okay, then tend to overly focus on the process itself as opposed to a result and end state. Okay? And those are often criticisms against the association. Now, but having said that, I think that nonetheless, that process remains important, right? Okay, because trying to arrive at a common position, trying to arrive at a concerted effort is worth that. Is really worth that build up, right? So I think what is important to recognize is that processes remain important, although, right? Okay, we all want to see these processes turn into results. Okay, but sometimes it is simply not as easy as it sounds because of that diversity, right? Okay, and the different positions that each member state will have. Now, what then do I think about how this applies to Central Asia? I think what is important actually is to recognize that, within Central Asia, okay, the people, the states have got a far more common experience, right, than states within Southeast Asia. Right? Let me just give you an example. Right, when I first arrived in Tashkent, right, okay, I went off into Kazakhstan. I took a day trip to Shymkent, right, and I had my driver bring me over to Kazakhstan, right, and he could speak to the Kazakhs in Russian and so on, right. So that commonality of language alone, okay, is actually important, right? Because there is a way to communicate, there is a way to essentially build upon a shared experience. And this is something that was challenging for ASEAN at the beginning, right? When some of the later states joined ASEAN, right, they had no common working language, right, save for English, right? And for some of the newer states within ASEAN, English was not even their third or fourth language. It was like all down the list, right? Okay, so that trouble communicating and everything, right, took time to essentially overcome. Right. So if anything, I think that actually Central Asia starts from a better position.
Yeah, indeed, this is very interesting. Indeed, we have lots of commonalities in terms of culture, history, religion, even language. All Central Asian countries when I say all this, Kazakh, Kyrgyz, Uzbek, and Turkmen, they're all like Turkic languages, and we speak different dialects of Turkic languages. So in fact, for example, when I speak Uzbek, our neighbors can understand what I am saying in Uzbek to a certain extent. So in addition to Russian language, we have, I think, the less explored assets when it comes to this regional integration or regional cooperation process. So, like you talked about process, right? Within this context, what do you think? Do you think political will is important than institutional design, or do you think it should be they should go in line together? What do you think?
Right. Thanks. So I think there is really no one cookie cutter template for something like this. Right. A lot has got to do with your own regional dynamics and so on. Right. But having said that, I think what was instructive in the ASEAN process was that all the states involved were willing to make that effort, were willing to join together, right? Okay? Because they recognized the value, right, okay, in coming together as a group, right? And I think so long as that value continues to be recognized, so long as that value continues to be appreciated, right? Okay, then everything else, there are problems, but with time, right? Okay, the grouping can continue to work on those problems, right? And therefore, so long as they recognize the value, right? Okay, whether or not it is individually in terms of the individual countries themselves, okay, or whether or not it is through institutional design. At the end of the day, so long as that value is recognized, then things can continue to progress, right? It is really not just about the institutional design per se, right? If you look at, for instance, the United Kingdom, I mean, at the end of the day, they also made the choice, right, to withdraw from the European Union, right? Because they no longer saw the value of staying. Right.
Okay, so from your perspective, this understanding the value of working together is also important in this process, right? Interesting. So from your perspective, if you could give one piece of strategic advice to Central Asian countries right now, based on your experience in research and practical experience in military studies, so what would it be?
Thanks for that. Right, that's a very interesting question. Right, and off the top of my head, I would say that when it comes to grouping together, naturally that internal, the dynamics internal to the group, the dynamics are very important, right? But at the same time, right, when you want to continue as a group, that outward-facing part is also going to be crucial, right? So, because when it comes to especially identity, right, identity is oftentimes not just about the self, but what the self is in relation to the other, right? So that outward-facing perspective of the group in engaging with others, right, is also going to be important when it comes to your group cohesion, right? So what this really means is that yes, Central Asia can recognize the value of coming together as a group, but then they need to interface that with that common position, right, with people outside the group, right, in dealing with, for instance, ASEAN or China and so on.
Yeah, indeed, it's very interesting. I think we have also talks about this coming up as a one economic and political voice and international relations, and adopting common positions when it comes to relations to other external actors such as China, Russia, European Union, United States, and other countries. So, Dr. Chang, thank you for joining us, sharing your insights on hedging strategies, securitization, and vulnerability. I think our listeners will come away with lots of to think about. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.